my first question is that we've heard all these really fascinating and interesting talks today about how you can approach this field and how it has been approached by artists and curators, and but it seems to me that the direction is coming mainly from the artist sides. It's not so much from the science side. It's not the scientists who are going out asking, can we please get some artists to help us with this issue? We want to understand something better. We need to communicate something better. We need some artists to help us out with this process. I don't see that. And also from my own experience working at a institute with lots of scientists, that was never something that I heard. Yeah, I know you're not sitting in that chair. You're not the scientist, but can you explain to me why that is?
Science at the moment is such a high pressure environment that like taking one step off the career path is often suicide. At least within the biomedical sciences, you have to. I mean, there's such a pressure on producing papers, and so junior scientists who might be sort of interested in the more conceptual side of things don't feel like they have the time to do it. And those who float to the top of the system are often those who are so kind of laser focused that they don't get it. Now that's a bit of a characterization because there are of course people who step out of that role, but I think at least within the biomedical science, that's a big part of the reason people just don't have time. I mean, they really that there's it's. I mean, we feel pressure in the humanities, but it ain't nothing compared to the biomedical sciences.
Yeah, maybe just to add on and emphasize what you just said, I think when we talk about research at universities, we have to talk about the funding. And even with humanities, where I'm from, I'm a historian by training, I've noticed with the different research projects that I've been responsible for, that the quality and the outcomes of that research that the funding institution wants to see after the 2 or 3 years is very much modeled now actually on the natural sciences. So they talk about products. They ask whether we can have patents coming out of our humanities research, whether there's going to be something that's going to go on the market as an industrial product, or how our research will contribute to that. So we, I think, need to talk about funding and you know, a sort of appreciation of transdisciplinary research going into that. And I don't really, I see it more as a problem now, as you do.
I'm not going to give any characterization of what's holding scientists back. I'm just learning this field. But I can say one thing that I think is a more of a general trend in society, which I think is a shift towards applied creativity. That you can't talk about creativity in its pure sense. And I think the clip you showed with the scientists talking about creativity, I think that's a term that can cross all these disciplines. That a lot of times we forget that scientists are extremely creative and they have a very precious relationship to the notion of creativity. I think just in a local context, Niels Bohr, I mean, I think you would call him a creative mind before you would even call him a scientist. And I think that's really important that we nurture this idea of creativity before we talk about it being applied. And that's really, I think, what we are fighting against, that every time we are creative, we need to justify it. I mean, in the arts, it's so obvious. People keep asking, what is art good for? And I think if you ask that question, you have already lost, basically.
Well, I guess I would never self-identify as a scientist, but at MIT, that's what they put on the door for me at the lab. So I can then speak from that position, because they give it to me. And I just showed you, I invited all of these artists to go in the field and look at the destruction of 2 key lungs on the planet, the Amazon and the Indonesian rainforest and peatland. And some of my colleagues think that maybe is odd selection to curate work about land use change, but it seems to me that it might be a more urgent question to ask of what will it matter about our arguments about our careers and our funding if people cannot breathe or drink or eat things? And so I think the part of what we're trying to do is bring the urgency of problems that are completely not even indifferent to disciplines. The absence of livable ecosystems doesn't really care which lab is working on that problem. And so I really think the really challenging question is, how do we communicate the awareness of the danger of those situations to a public? And that requires livable collaborations on every side, maybe.
I can add to all what was said already. Not that we wanted to agree the whole time, but we are obviously agreeing here, and this is actually really important. There is so much at stake. And absolutely agree, we have to go even beyond all the scientific disciplines when artists want to open up the dialogue for artist-science collaboration. There is this wonderful term from STEM to STEAM. So there's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And the STEAM, that is the A, the art comes in. And that was developed from the Rhode Island School of Design. And I think it has arrived now in Europe a little bit. And we are really working with that. And from STEM to STEAM. And it seems that in Berlin we really try hard to have it arrived, and we are collaborating at the moment very heavily with microbiologists that really look for these creative powers, that look to open up the discourse platform of urgent question at the moment. Biotechnology is probably the field that changes the fastest.
Yeah, there's beginning to, I think in the last, really I could say year or two, I gathered that the funding bodies want to have this public outreach side, this kind of something's produced, that's how they see it. They kind of look at what they have in the US and a little bit in Britain, and they kind of see this, oh, that's what it's for. But a few scientists have also said, well, no, actually I want to shake up my people in my lab because we're reaching dead ends and we want new ways of thinking. And they'll actually go into the history, they'll go into like, you know, Fleming basically discovering penicillin by accident. As an example of that, so this idea of serendipity. But they will see artists as kind of like a way of shaking things up, allowing them to see things from different perspectives. So it's interesting to have scientists approaching us on this and finding it interesting, as well as saying, okay, you can also be positive for a grant application because you can be an interesting public outreach, which we're willing to do because it's a way of hacking the system. I think there's also this problem, and I think scientists are kind of aware of this, but they have to, to get their bread and butter too. And that's the thing is that, this idea to have the patents, to have the, the short-term profits, the products and patents, is what brings them in the money, the grant money to do the research. But they're also kind of aware in the back of their mind that, there were in 5 years, 10 years down the road, which is where the funding bodies are looking, things may not change that much, but 30 or 40 or 50, it's going to be a problem. And I said earlier, like, for a lot of people, idea of soil bacteria isn't exciting, but I think the UN FAO said 2 years ago that it's 1% of arable or fertile topsoil is lost on the planet a year to erosion, but mainly bad agricultural methods, mainly mass modernist agricultural methods. And basically all the foods we eat come from being in topsoil. 80% of vascular plants need to have this fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, to exist. So basically, by the end of the century, there's going to be a big crisis. But we're kind of sailing blindly into it on this kind of short-term funding idea of fund things that are going to bring profits in the next 5 to 10 years, and we won't worry about 2050 or 2075.
It's a very practical question. It was like the two last speakers, or like 3 or whatever, like it's talked about in-lab experiments with artists. How long do you normally give an artist to like develop something in the lab? Because I know from experience that just order stuff can take like a month, and like things that you think you can do in 2 months often take like half a year, and like stuff like that. So like how long time do you normally, or like what time periods are you working with if you have to develop something technically?
Oh, yeah.
I think it takes a lot of preparation beforehand, so it's not like just throw them in. It's a matter of artists having the education or the experience, and then that lab time ending perhaps, them coming up with an idea, getting another residency, preparing that beforehand, and so on. That's what Symbiotica is so amazing, because you actually have the students all year round working, and they have a project, and there's a certain amount of time given to them by scientists, and then they have a lab, and they learn how to work on their own. So when we've brought artists to Berlin with works that are already done, they can just go in a lab in a couple of days and produce what they need, grow the candida, or do the, send the frozen stem cells and have them turned into neurons in a course of a week and a half or something. So it's just usually basically giving them the time under the hood in the space, but to actually do the development is a bit of a longer case. And it all depends on the technology. I mean, there's more and more stuff you can do in DIY, but in Europe, for instance, you can't do anything on a level 2 organism. When we showed the work by Tarsh Bates, we actually used a cousin of albicans, parapsilosis, which is also on the human microbiome, but just because of regulations, which is, in story itself. But basically, it's something I think that there needs to be more art schools with labs, just so people can go into a lab later on without having to be trained. And the residencies depend, but I think the artists also have a disadvantage, is that they have to be prepared and order everything beforehand. On the other hand, places like Biologie Garagen or the Vogue Society can offer space for artists to develop things, and then maybe only at a certain phase go into a professional lab, or even do things outside. I mean, a lot of the things that are done in Indonesia, for instance, were done in DIY labs, maybe with consulting and a little bit of time in the university.
I think Jakob also wanted to.
I think another aspect to this question, because that's a very, very real problem, is Oren Katz, who runs Symbiotica, has developed a notion which kind of runs into that, which is the aesthetics of disappointment. The sense in which a lot of the works, or at least some of the works that he made, they die, or they don't work, or they produce, they talk about these grand concepts, and then they produce something that's about this big, which I think is both practical, because lab work is hard and it doesn't work and it dies, so there's both that, but then of course it also speaks more conceptually to the fact that a or at least a large part of science doesn't really do much, Of course it's important as a part of the giant scientific enterprise, but there are so many so many scientific projects that costing millions that do very, very little. So in that sense, the aesthetics of disappointment becomes both a practical relationship to the work that's done, but also a meta comment on the structures of scientific endeavor, which I think is.
I think it's normal when you handle like a scientific thesis or master thesis, for example, then you describe the results, and the results don't have to be results, just have to describe when you're done. And many times it's just being with.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question which probably most is for Nina and Etienne, but everyone feel free. As maybe it grounds in some kind of envy towards the big museums and the temporality of big science museums. Because what I think is a huge advantage of a museum, like you're working on, is that the exhibition is up for a really, really long time. And what that means is that people will come going back, and eventually these exhibitions will reformat how people think about a certain topic. I mean, that temporality is so important, and it's very different from art museums, where you have at the most 6 months, at the most, usually 2 to 3 months. And that's why also I guess also for you, Jen, it would be ideal to have that exhibition stored there for like 10 years. So people would actually really see natural science in the light of the proposal that you brought to the museum. So in that way, although you kind of mocked the museum in a way, I think it also holds a huge potential in this way of putting exhibitions on displays for so long time that it can actually seep into the public unconsciousness.
Maybe just to add on it, with the special exhibitions that we've had in the last 2 or 3 years before that, we actually didn't do special exhibitions so much. But with the recent ones, they've been up for a year and a half, or the next one's going to be just a year, but that's even more than a couple of months. So I do agree. I don't think we see it as an advantage yet, so I'm actually going to take that back home, because it could maybe help, because I think to drive that further, interesting for me would be to sort of make something out of it, that the fact that it's up there for quite a while, so people may actually come back and see it twice or even 3 times, which we know some people do. And so it poses the question how we could maybe actually create an exhibition that changes over the course of its showing. Like talking about participation of visitors in one way or another, and create more of a living thing, an exhibition that actually sort of maybe just reflects on whatever visitors have already given us as a feedback on the exhibit. That would maybe be another step of making it even more relevant, because right now it just stands for a year and we don't really make much out of it. We don't see an advantage yet, but maybe we could actually do a little bit more with that we have it. We basically only have it for a year or maybe a year and a half, because even us, we don't have enough money to change it quicker. We would actually love to have more exhibitions, but we just don't have the money. So that's why it's up for a year.
You were actually mentioning orange cuts, and I noted that I like this aesthetics of disappointment, and exactly that very same orange cuts was talking about the aesthetics of care, and in the context of art science art. But I would actually enlarge this to a larger degree, because we all here deal next to our different theoretical fields with curating, and I would stress maybe a little bit with pathos, I exaggerate and say our task is very, very important, and I think the role of not the curator. Several of us also were expressing the idea of the collective. You spoke about us. We have already an us in the production, but I mean, then maybe it's not the right word, curator, but to make projects of interdisciplinary kind and then call them exhibitions, or to expose this to the public, I think there lies a big responsibility in how do we address the public? How do we engage this? You were saying this from the Munich example. What do we think the public is capable of? Do we take them serious? Do we think they can cope with complex, open questions? What do we want to have back from them? And I can only talk about our humble experience of our institution that is not a museum, but it's like a Kunstverein of the size. But what we developed in the last 2 years, this is a really funny expression, but all journalists ask us, what do you do then? How do you cope with the public? And because they go to the exhibition and they stay for hours, and how do you do this to attract them to these complex themes? And we call it sustainable curating. That means we offer them the artworks, we offer them as transparent as we can, and we offer them actually folders of knowledge if they want it, from basic theme up to peer-reviewed papers, because we take them serious, and there are people who really want to understand what about Candida is. They're amazingly lots of public, and they're mostly, of course, not the specialists. They're not the scientists coming, or hardly ever. Okay, we have a lot of microbiologists who are interested, but a lot of broad public. And I think it's time that we take the audience really serious as autonomous thinkers, and they want to maybe contribute, and they want to actually find out. And we were talking about didactics, or being not wanting to come along didactic. Maybe we don't have to actually try to find a word about that, but I think this can also help to step out of the scientific frame, to step out of the artist's studio for long, but then actually in contexts like exhibiting something in whatever institution it is or so. I think to present as much and to give as much and to make workshops and talks and seminars and conferences, I think this is really, really important to really give away these complex things.
Yeah, it was interesting. We actually wanted to bring Life Patch to Berlin, not in an exhibition, but in just a way of working together with local artists. But the only thing that could fund it would be the Federal Foundation for Culture, and they were like, one of their bureaucrats said, "Oh, you want us to fund bringing a bunch of nerds to Moabit?" was their question. That was where the residency would have been. And I was just thinking when I was looking at the pictures from the Turbine Hall, and I was thinking when I've been to the Deutsches Museum and watching people, and how I also kind of love these old exhibits, because they kind of have this thing where some people you kind of walk in and you can see how things have been there for a while and how they've been explained and changed, and other people come in, and of all those 1.5 million people who come, most of them are probably like most of the general public in general, have one or two passions, hobbies, where they're nerds. So basically, you could probably take 80% of the population are nerds. Some are about turbines, and some might be about looms, and some might, and that's really the thing. And it's but the interesting thing is also to find, the passionate people I meet in kind of DIY communities in Berlin that are beginning to grow up in the last few years, and they're coming from really diverse fields, and some of them just had a little bit of biology in high school, or even they were in university, but then they left and got a job in something else, but they want to continue this passion. And some are artists, and some are grad students in biology, and they're all kind of mixing together and meeting. But I think there's this idea often at museums, and I'm hoping that the Humboldt Forum isn't going to be an example of this, though when I was with Etienne looking at on a trip years ago and looking at this plans or ideas for the Humboldt Forum, it seemed to be this idea that kind of treats the public as kind of stupid and kind of has to be spoon-fed, and everything has to be gamified, I think, and so forth. And I said usually my opinion is that a lot of people are very smart about something and very into it, and if you take if the height of each person, then at sort of the lowest point, you get both more interesting museums, but you also get much more appreciation. Also, because I suspect people know when they're being taken for idiots and don't really like it.
In the world of science I don't need this one, I have this one, of science and science museums and natural history museums, one of the big things the last 5 years have been citizen science, empowering people to participate in science, especially because, as you say, there are experts everywhere, and even if you're not an expert, you can contribute. If you just make a little step, then you can contribute collecting data on all kind of things. Do you think that the art world could work like that as well?
This is a great question. So, the Cornell Lab for Ornithology has the most advanced so-called citizen science project. I don't like to use that word because I don't think knowledge is a nation-building project. I think it's different. So, if we can say resident knowledge, resident science. People who reside in a place know some stuff about that place. And so a Cornell lab for ornithology built the software that people could say, a bird is in my yard. And now a bird flew away. And then they start to add that up. And in the end, they have millions of people recording all of the movement of birds all over the world. And now they have more data scientists than they do ecologists, because they have to help manage that data. But then they have developed all of these various interfaces for different publics. So some people really like to go looking in nests for eggs. I don't know which kind, but there's some kind that like that. Other people like to look in the yard for what color of the bird. And so by looking at how people come, this evaluation, like you're saying, who likes it, then they can build better interface to attract more people. But how could the museum be like this? I think one of the big questions is, when you go there, if it's science, technology, natural history, or art, the museum is presenting a way that the world is ordered for you to understand. They say, paintings go like this, frogs go over there, beetles are on that side, and this is this. This machine is different than that machine. And so it gives an order logic. But when the world is being ripped apart and disordered, is that the most useful thing for a museum to do? And so I think as an interface, as a habitat interface, the question of democratizing that space and decolonizing that space is about letting people here in Europe hear what people in other places at the front line of those situations are trying to say. So, and I give the example, Maria Teresa Alves, 33 elders from the Amazon saying, to you, hey, you're in the museum and they're talking to you. The people from Armin Linke's film, they're talking to you. And so we're using that as an interface where you can be in a conversation with someone who you have common problems with. And I think this is a very important platform to see the museum as a platform for democratization. Yeah?
I completely agree. I think this is a super important point. And I'm just going to add one of my big inspirations in this field is the, I guess the general term would be anthropologist Wade Davis, who's written extensively on not the Anthropocene, but basically the extension of people. And what he points out is what disappears with the disappearance of different people cultures is actually a knowledge of the world. And I think that's actually what you're referring to here, is that we need to know this knowledge. There's a different way of knowing the world outside of the Western paradigm of science. And those voices need to be heard now more than ever, because we've run into dead ends with Western science in some sense. And I think that's why there is all the sense in the world to open up to these more, you could call them spiritual, but different ways of looking at the world embedded in nature.
And actually, I'd like to add a little bit like a consequence what you both just said, and you were putting the question about the art world. Probably it goes without saying, and that I want to say that probably all our talks show that in the, I call it the pure high commercial art world, these interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, or as Lapointe said, paradisciplinary processes would not really happen. Why? Not only because of the commercial part, but also because there's this big super ego artist idea still in the art world, in the art world. And it's interesting actually that you go into the natural history museum context. And that is interesting that you talk, and I liked your irony in your presentation, that you talk coming out of the technical context, yeah, and so you also talked about interdisciplinary processes as we tried out, and so I would be very skeptical. So if we want to really enter the, let's talk about maybe the 21st century avant-gardistic terrain to really change something, it would be only boring to go to an art museum.
But like it's just. Like science is people working on problems in a way that have identifiable patterns and habits. And so, but maybe other people who have different patterns and habits, what we would call an epistemology, have useful ways of seeing that problem. Well, like the same with the rhino tooth. Okay, you might not know something about what the rhino needs to eat, but there are people in Sumatra who are familiar with this and can tell you this from their collecting of the dung to use for something else. And so, but those conversations, which are completely enabled by the level of communication technology we have, are completely undermined by the stupidity of the hierarchy of knowledge in the museum. And so, but we can, there's no reason to critique it, it's just to just replace it with it, to democratize it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a similar thing that you find in the Medical Historical Museum, because you have the hierarchical relationship between doctors and patients, which often functions along similar lines of power, and in a sense, the moment there is finding ways of making exhibitions that allow space for the experience of patients, rather than looking at a kind of progressivist march towards something continuously better. You can try to make spaces where people can inject their own experiences and also get that, because I mean the march of history can be used for many things, but at least two of them. One is to point to this kind of, to create this narrativist progress towards something better, but the other thing is the sort of the moment in which you realize that the thing you think is right now is completely contingent, right? So you can look at your treatment and go, well, they really didn't know a lot of what they were doing 50 years ago. Maybe they don't know now as well. And that doesn't mean that science doesn't do good things, but that moment of creating a slightly more porous relationship to science and a slightly more spacious one, I think, is for me the aesthetics of care in this, and creating and curating exhibitions that allow for that kind of slightly more porous, slightly more spacious relationship to authority is incredibly important.
So if I am to sum up what you have said, which I will not try to do, but what you're all agreeing on is that there's a way to democratizing what's going on when you go into an exhibition space, whether it's an art museum or a natural history museum, and that there are urgent, pressing problems that needs to be addressed, and that bridging the gap, bringing art and science closer, because art can help us feel things, is at least a step in the direction that we need to go. Is that it?
Yes.
So I want to end optimistic, because there's a lot of very, very pessimistic things that we could talk about, and why a lot of you are into this in the first place, and all the. I mean, there's a reason it's called the Anthropocene, and why this lecture series is about that. And I think it is very pressing and deeply, deeply concerning. But at least that there are people out there trying.
Yeah, but there are also the multitudes in there.
Mm.
This is the point, right? We have the whole cosmos and everything inside, and all of the stuff out of the technology museum, and people making beer already, and lube, and whatever else we need. And so I think we have a lot of common resources to deal with our common problems if we would stop organizing them in such stupid ways. And so it's quite amazing to see, and I think it's a quite positive panel, that all of the resources we could ever need to solve any of those problems, we just organize them in completely stupid ways. That's what was called the policy.
Yeah.
How are we going to go about it?
If we were coming from outer space, trying to survey what's going on the planet, we wouldn't think that there were lots of people there. That wouldn't be what we were seeing. A little bit, depending on how we're looking at it. We would actually see that there are a lot of bacteria who has colonized people and who is driving a population very, very cleverly, just like you'll see termites growing fungi or something in a termite nest. So from outer space, it's a planet of microbes that are doing incredibly well.
Myra Bird calls it the ethics of fragility.
I don't know if
we realize
yeah.
the fact that
Yeah.
we're a tiny portion of this.
Yeah. So the major part of the planning is actually doing quite well, but it's the part that we want it to be, is not doing very well. But I don't think there's a lot of comfort there. But it depends on your perspective always. Thank you so much for giving us such a fruitful day and a delightful day, and thank you for staying with us. I hope you'll continue the discussion on the way home and later. Thank you.